A big hello there to you. I hope I find you well. I'm Jennifer Kirk, welcoming you back up here to the loft on Weir Yard. Now today, well, it's a really hot day, so it's one of the reasons that the computer screens behind me are not switched on. I'm just trying to keep down that heat generation. And when the weather's like this, well, I think it's always a great time to kick back and make lists of your favourite things. And today, we're going to be taking a look through my top 10 favourite classes of LNER group derived locomotives. Now these are going to be all the locomotives that were made either by the constituents to the LNER or by the LNER themselves, and I've gone through my collection and picked out, after a lot of agonising it must be said, my top 10 favourites. So come with me and let's go on a journey to see whether the 10 that I pick are the same 10 that you might pick yourself. Today's video comes in association with Trainomatic, makers of DCC decoders and accessories that are designed by enthusiasts for enthusiasts, and you can find all of their products available to buy from their UK stockist Tramfabrique at tramfabrique.co.uk. Additional support comes from TMC, themodelcentre.com, whose hot summer sale is on now, so grab yourself a bargain of up to 60% off RRP on a whole range of new as well as second-hand pre-loved bargains. You can also specify renumbering, weathering and detailing too to any of the items available for sale. There's also an additional 5% off at checkout if you enter the code HOT. But hurry, these prices are too good to stick around. Find them now at themodelcentre.com. But without further ado, come with me and let's see what my top 10 LNER locomotives were. First things first, a little bit of admin. I just need to apologise for the constant drone of some fans. The reason for this is that I'm filming this on what could well be one of the hottest days of the year, and the only way that Weir Yard is even remotely habitable is to have all the computers switched off and all the fans switched on, and this includes a recently installed extractor fan, which is the constant drone that you're probably hearing on the audio track. When it comes to a top 10 of favourite locomotives, I think everybody has their own personal choices. And for me, when it comes to the LNER, there's actually quite a wealth of models that have been released over the years, and I actually had quite some difficulty in choosing just the top 10. Indeed, even just picking 10 locomotives that were my favourites was really hard, even before I tried to put them into any kind of order. And there's a lot of locomotives really that were vying for that number 10 spot, simply because there were so many which really I could have put in the top 10 but didn't have the space. And what won out was the Bachmann J11, which is represented here by my 9J variant in Great Central Dark Green. I'm told it is a green, although it does look like lined black. But I did read somewhere that it's a very dark green. Now, as number 316, she was produced as a Bachmann Collectors Club special, and it just goes to show one of the great draws of the Collectors Club is access to some really interesting livery examples such as this. And it's certainly the case that over the years they've done quite a few unusual liveries that have proven to be incredibly popular, and this one is no exception. At the time, I think it held the record for being the fastest selling out model from the Collectors Club, but in all honesty with you, I think each new one really does take that record. The club itself is growing more and more popular, and I suspect that they haven't upped the quantities that they make of these models, which makes them a real true limited edition. The Great Central Railway livery really is something which I love, and I'm a big fan of pre-grouping liveries, but Great Central is one, and certainly the freight locomotives, that really does stand out for me, and it shows just what an amount of attention those pre-grouping companies gave to their locomotives in the heady times before we had austerity in the Second World War, the Great Depression, and it certainly does look the part. There were a lot of other locomotives I could have chosen for number 10, but I plumped for the J11. The next locomotive I've chosen comes from the Hornby stable, and it's the Claude Hamilton D16. These were quite an interesting locomotive, originally from the Great Eastern Railway, but as part of my LNER top 10, the model that I've got is in this very, very fetching LNER Doncaster green. It's a model that kind of escaped the notice of my radar for an inordinate amount of time. And I'm not really quite sure why. I suspect because the only versions that I saw about so quickly after initial release were the really plain black versions, which didn't really do anything for me. But when I saw this model come up second-hand from Tim's Arcadia Models price to sell second-hand table, I really couldn't resist. As Claude Hamilton herself, this really is an attractive model. There are a few deficiencies, such as that really plain under the boiler area, but a lot of this does get forgiven, because actually this is a superb model of a highly interesting and aesthetically pleasing prototype. The running qualities too of this locomotive, despite the fact it doesn't have any traction tyres, which I'm not a huge fan of, is quite impressive, and it did manage a particularly good load behind it, which is something that the 440s do sometimes suffer from, in that in model form they don't seem to have the traction that they need. So all in all, I decided that this was my 9th favourite LNER locomotive. For my next locomotive, we're back to Bachmann, and this is the J72, one of their flagship shunting locomotives for so long in their range. Indeed, it was there at the start of Bachmann, and owes its origin even further back to the days of mainline, when it was made by Cada for that company in the 1970s. At the time, it really was ahead of the game, but age is not kind on models, and certainly by the time Bachmann chose to retire that model and retool from scratch this all-new J72, it really had been getting long in the tooth. But we weren't disappointed by the model that Bachmann produced, and it is accurate in so many ways and features so many new features that original failed to get. Reliability, this model really does make the grade. And here, as per the J11 that we talked about at the number 10 slot, this too is a Bachmann Collectors Club special release. It's in the BR rendition of Northeastern Railway green, although this looks a little bit darker when you compare it to the actual Northeastern Railway green. This represents the preserved member of the class, in a livery that it carried in the 1980s when it ran steam excursions on the then Derwent Valley Light Railway before that line closed, and indeed it has been seen at the stub of that line that is in preservation at the Yorkshire Museum of Farming. The livery itself owes homage back to the Newcastle Central shunters, turned out by Gateshead Shed in the 1960s, where the railwaymen really did dote over these small shunting locomotives, turning them out in this representation of this livery. And I really do like the Northeastern Railway crest there on the side, and it's one of the many detail points for this locomotive that really does look something special. I was torn between this and the original Northeastern Railway green version that Bachmann put out in the main range. I have both of them, but this one just edged it for me to be the representative of the number 8 slot in my LNER top 10. For number 7, we stay with Bachmann, but we go back to the Great Central Railway, my favourite constituent of the London and North Eastern Railway. As a company, they provided a great many of the group's heavy freight locomotives with a consolidation wheel arrangement, and this was by virtue of the fact that their Robinson 8K locomotive was chosen during the First World War by the Rail Operations Division to be their standard heavy freight locomotive, and they made a huge number. After the war, whilst the Great Central Railway did pick up more, so did the Caledonian Railway, the London and North Western Railway, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, and the Great Western Railway, as well as a number of other railway lines overseas, seeing them get as far away as Australia, where a large number worked even into the 1970s. A single example is preserved in the National Collection as number 1185, represented here in model form, but 2 further locomotives have survived in Australia. They have that late Victorian, early Edwardian charm to them with their aesthetics, and I particularly like the way that they have a splasher that encompasses the rear 3 driving wheels and a separate splasher for the 4th. It really does make them aesthetically really interesting. The Great Central Railway really dark freight livery does look good, and it just shows that even on a dark, pretty much black livery, the lining really does make a locomotive come into its own. I have loads of these, and I have to say, it's one of the few classes of locomotive that I'm pretty much addicted to buying every version that Bachmann put out, certainly in British Railway livery, although I did make an exception for this, which was a special commission for the National Railway Museum, and it did sell out incredibly quickly. I am quite surprised that Bachmann haven't done the Great Central livery again with a different running number, although they have done the very utilitarian London and North Western Railway black version, as well as a Rail Operating Division variant. They also did a westernised version representing those locomotives that made it to the Great Western Railway and were Swindonised and kept on, even lasting through to British Railway days. But this locomotive I'm quite happy to make my number 7 of my all-time top 10 LNER locomotive favourites. For 6th place in this top 10, we return to the Hornby mark and also 2 small shunting locomotives, and I've picked the J50. It was a little bit of an unsung model of their range when they introduced an all-new tooled version with a number of different bunker variants to boot. In model form, LNER was the first to bring out a J50, although that model does seem incredibly crude by modern standards, so it was most welcome when Hornby announced that they were tooling up a modern standard version of this model. I've actually bought quite heavily into the J50, being won over by its charm. I have 2 in LNER black, 1 lined, 1 unlined, and I have the departmental number 14 with the late BR crest, one of the very late survivors, and this, which I purchased second hand at an incredibly good price. It has to be said that the J50 is quite a heavy locomotive in model form and runs flawlessly on Weir Yard. That additional weight does mean that it packs quite a punch and can pull quite a long train. I like the authoritarian, utilitarian look of these angled tanks that were angled that way so that the driver could get a much better view of the front of the locomotive, because with a squared off tank it would have blocked the view for quite a distance in front. You see this style on a number of other of the LNER type locomotives, and it's a common feature to improve forward visibility, which, it has to be remembered, in the days of steam was pretty woeful. There isn't really much to fault on these locomotives, and I've featured them in reviews a number of times. That's why I've been quite happy to put this into number 6 in my top 10 LNER model locomotives. For number 5, we stay with Hornby, and it's an area that Hornby have done particularly well, with a large number of LNER variants appearing in model form in their catalogue, and some of them, including this, the B12, have been updated numerous times over the years to keep them bang up to date. I already had a BR Black version of the B12, and I was particularly won over by the aesthetics of those 6 coupled driving wheels quite close together and the really short tender designed so that this locomotive could pack a maximum punch while still being able to fit on the standard Great Eastern Railway turntables. To me, it's a combination that does just look really quite fine in model form. The BR version in black does look good, but in this LNER Doncaster Apple Green, it looks even better to me. And again, this was a model I recently picked up and was really pleased to add to my collection. Unlike the D16 that we featured before, we've got much more detail going on underneath the boiler, and that, for me, is one of the reasons that this is edged up ahead of that D16. The Great Eastern Railway were early adopters of the Westinghouse air brakes, and you can see that these models include that Westinghouse air pump on the side. Another incredible detail fixture on this model from Hornby. When you compare this to really what was quite frankly a basic model of the 1970s in their range, it really is nice to see that Hornby have cared enough to keep on updating this model and make sure that it doesn't get outpaced. Along with a few others in their range, it does strike me that they regard this as one of their flagship models. Everything about this really does work well, and this is a sterling performer on the layout, and on wear yard it has run flawlessly on a number of Monday clubs, earning it number 5 in my top favourite LNER list. At number 4 on the list we return to Bachmann, and it has to be said that so far Bachmann and Hornby have really dominated, and I suppose it goes to show just how important the LNER has been to both brands' ranges. This particular model is the C1 Atlantic. In original Great Northern Railway livery, this was produced for the National Railway Museum as a commission and did exceptionally well. Available in Great Northern Railway Green, LNER Green and BR Black, there were a number of different versions for the modellers to choose from, although predictably the pre-grouping Great Northern Railway version did sell out particularly quickly. With its 442 Atlantic wheel arrangement, it was quite unusual in model form at the time, and a lot of people had wondered just how well the 442 wheel arrangement would fare as a model, and actually what Bachmann proved with this was that they could make it work exceptionally well, and it opened the door to the H1 and H2 Atlantics too, all of which have been sterling performers. I must admit that everything about this model really does ooze charm, and I'm only too happy to put it into the number 4 in my all-time LNER top 10. When we reviewed this model, it did review highly, and I still regard it as one of my favourite locomotives in my collection. It's back to Hornby for the number 3 slot, and I've chosen the K1Mogul. The LNER weren't exactly massive fans of the 260 Mogul wheel arrangement, but the K1 was certainly a very strong performer. Now, I did have a choice between the K1 and the K3, which are quite similar locomotives, and I did and ah a bit about introducing the Bachmann K3 into my top 10. But for me, the Hornby K1, with its slightly more modern mechanism and much easier to DCC fit, and particularly sound fit, being that it has the DCC decoder slot in the tender, where it is presented with a whole lot extra room, which makes the sound fitting so much easier, I decided that the K1 was the locomotive which I would put into the top 10. But it comes with the caveat that I do quite like the K3 as well. The model itself runs flawlessly, and when I reviewed this, there really wasn't anything much to disappoint. This was acquired as a second-hand model, detailed up with a crew on the footplate, but certainly it shows that an awful lot of good models are out there second-hand to purchase at a really good price, letting somebody else pay the depreciation for you, and I have not been disappointed with this example. So much so, I have to say that whenever I look at Hereford Model Centre and in danger of a certain Monday clubber going, "No, my bargains," I do keep eyeing up some of the other K1s that they have in their really well priced new old stock range. But I'm quite happy to add this in at number 3. At number 2 on my list, we finally get a look in from a manufacturer other than Bachmann and Hornby, and it is the Oxford Rail N7 that makes the cut. Now, I must confess that way back when these first came out, they were the first locomotive that I had got my hands on from Oxford Rail. I bought the Great Eastern Railway Grey example, and I must admit I was somewhat disappointed. It turned out I had a quality control fail, and with hindsight I was probably quite hard on that locomotive, especially given the warranty replacement was perfect in every way. And it's always been something that niggled at me ever since, that maybe I was just a little bit harsh on the model. When this BR example as 69612 turned up for sale through Rails of Sheffield at the time, for a price brand new that was probably only about £15 more than what it would cost to buy the ESU sound decoder with the N7 sound file on, I just had to jump at the chance, and I was certainly not disappointed. When I did the review on this model, I did feel to some degree like I was putting right that rather harsh initial review of the N7, and it is certainly a model which I look forward to more examples being released from Oxford Rail, not least because they are incredibly competitively priced. This particular model has served faultlessly on Weir Yard, and with a lot of die-cast metal within its structure, it packs a lot of weight. Everything on it does feel right, and I particularly like those fluted coupling rods too. It just does ooze charm and quality, and has been a faultless performer, and that's why I'm going to put this into number 2 on my all-time LNER list. When it comes to deciding what goes into the number 1 slot, there's so many models that could have made this top 10, and I wonder if you can guess what the number 1 might have been. In fact, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section, see what you would put as your top 10 LNER locomotives. For me, the decision was quite tough, and I've already mentioned one of the also-rans in the form of the K3, but I've picked out 4 more here which really were difficult not to include in my top 10. The Bachmann A1 really is a fine locomotive. Even though it's been on the market in this form for quite some time, it does still punch above its weight. The Hornby J36 too was a welcome addition for models north of the border, representing the North British Railway, and in its many guises, including this, in its preserved North British Railway livery, it really was a great model to have in my collection. I felt a little bit guilty about not including the Rapido J70. As a first model from that marque, it really was a great representative model of that really quite strange locomotive. Toby the Tram engine was based on this, and certainly it looks like no other locomotive particularly that was ever made, except perhaps the four-wheeled version of exactly the same thing. often these locomotives, when running at speed on the main line, could be mistaken for a runaway brake van, and it gives them a particular jaunty charm. And then there's the Q6, that heavy freight locomotive that Hornby introduced that really does look the part. It's hard to believe that I've still only got one example here in LNER black in my collection, and on my hit list is definitely picking up a BR example to add to my fleet. But what are you choosing for your top 10? Have any of my examples aligned with what you would have chosen? Or do you wholeheartedly disagree, and are there other models that you would put up there? Let me know in the comments section down below. So what did I choose for the number 1 slot? I wonder if it's exactly the same as what you might have chosen. Well, of course, it had to be the A4 Pacific. How could it not be? This is a locomotive class that I've had a love relationship with since being really quite young, when I remember a second-hand Hornby 00 Silver King turning up one Christmas. It was like nothing else I'd ever seen, with this streamlined front, and certainly these streaks, as they were nicknamed, really did look so different and so modern from anything else that ran on Britain's railways at the time. They were the only streamlined locomotive that retained their streamlining to the end, and really, in model form, they're one of the flagship locomotives of not just the Hornby fleet, but the Bachmann fleet too. This particular example, Miles Beaver, is one of the most recent that has come from Hornby, and I really do love these models, so much so that they're one of the few classes of locomotive that I strive to pick up as many as I can in different guises. I really love the BR liveries, and I think I'm on a mission to pick up an example of every single one in super detailed form that has been released or will be released, and certainly my fleet is currently at about 10 locomotives and growing. And currently I've got my eye on Wild Swan, a Hornby super detailed version that's for sale second hand online, and my finger keeps hovering above that buy button, and I don't need another A4. I've got a massive fleet of them. There's probably so many other locomotives that I could buy, but, well, you've just got to keep coming back, and baby's got to have more A4 in her life. So there it is. That's the number 1 in my list, and deservedly so. In fact, when you think about it, there couldn't have been any other locomotive at number 1 in this list. Well, I hope you really enjoyed today's video on what is actually an incredibly hot day. But were my top 10 the same as what you would have picked for your top 10? Or maybe you would have chosen some different models to appear? I'd love to hear from you in the comments section down below. So do leave a comment there, and I do read every single one. Also, please like and share this video, because sharing is caring, and it's a great way that you can help the channel to grow. We've also got the Monday Club Wagon still available to buy from the link down below, and you can order with confidence through Rails of Sheffield. And you can check us out over on Patreon and help support us to make the videos that you want to see. And indeed, we've also got our full merch store. So everything from My Railway, My Rules, Terrier Fest, right through to Billy's replacement speakers can be found there. Grab yourself a t-shirt, a hoodie, or maybe in this hot weather, just a mug to drink your cool drink from. They're all there and available now. But until next time, this is me, Jenny Kirk, saying you take great care of yourself. Happy modelling. Bye for now. Today's video comes in association with Trainomatic, makers of DCC decoders and accessories that are designed by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. Find the full range available to order now at tramfabrique.co.uk. Additional support comes to you from TMC, the Model Centre, whose hot summer sale is too hot to miss. Grab yourself a bargain now from either new items or second-hand items with anywhere up to a massive 60% off RRP. There's also an additional 5% off at checkout if you enter the code HOT. You can also specify to have custom weathering applied to any item that you buy, so grab yourself a bargain now at themodelcentre.com. I'd like to send out a huge thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon, and an extra special huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Offshore Allen, Michael Lockie, Helen Sink, Gary Lewis, David Quinn, Sparky107107, George Botterini, Chris Moss, Robert Steers, Sam Yates, Dale Williams, John N from NC, NYMRish, Jonathan Foster, Peter, Clifford Ison, Larry W. Grant, NI Railways 4000 class, Ian Coulson, Alan Dickerson, Eddie Papere, Karen Nichol, Medwin Williams, Crossways Point Junction, 3B Rail, and Jennifer Garrett. Thank you. Without you guys, I couldn't do this.